Tucker Carlson brought Kari Lake onto his program, and as you can imagine, it was a disaster. She spread all of her normal election lies about the Arizona election, and he supported them as much as possible. So here's the reason why we have to keep discussing this, and then we'll dive in this first clip from this interview. This is the symptom of the election denying disease or problem that we were calling out with Trump when he first started it all. And so as long as Trump has the relevance within the Republican Party and the MAGA movement does, which even when Trump moves along, we're still going to have this MAGA brand that might get behind somebody else, but will still be alive and well. We must talk about when the leaders kind of manifest into that dangerous set of beliefs and spreading the dangerous lies as she does. So she continues to pretend like her lawsuit's going to do something in Arizona, which it won't. And so here's the first moment from this interview.
We vote for a full month in Arizona with early ballots. And on election day, when the Republicans showed up, the election day voting was sabotaged. And that's what our case is going to prove. It's a 70-page lawsuit that reads like a real crime novel.
And of course, election day was not sabotaged in Arizona. It was perfectly fine. The one issue that they'll point at, as we've discussed extensively now, is that on election day, a few locations had tabulator problems, meaning the machines that tabulate the votes real quickly had issues. But the people who actually went and voted, the voters weren't prevented from voting. They just did their voting process and then put their ballot in a secure box, and then it was tabulated later, right? It was perfectly fine, and the tabulation machines got sorted out, or the tabulator machines. Here's a second moment that I want to take a look at with you.
Tens of thousands of ballots were rejected because there were no signatures or scribbles, and they somehow got thrown in and counted anyways.
No.
There are a plethora of problems that went down in Maricopa County, and if somebody doesn't stand up and say we can't have our elections being run this way, then we'll never have another fair election. I mean, 60% of the polling places on election day were inoperational or non-functioning.
Incorrect.
When do we stop and say enough is enough? Would it have to get to 80%, 90%, 100%? When do we say we need to have our elections run fair?
I completely agree with you. And if you care about democracy, this would be the top of your list. I'm glad you're doing this. Kari Lake, thank you for telling us about it tonight. Good to see you.
Just so heartened by the brave warrior that she is, Tucker Carlson. So with that being said, just to focus in on one of the claims that she made that we've already talked about being dishonest and incorrect, is this mismatched signatures, or that fraudulent ballots, because of the way that they were signed, were counted. It's just not true. We looked at this Yahoo News article when we went over the lawsuit when it was originally announced. And this one writes, Lake's lawsuit claims that hundreds of thousands of illegal ballots infected the election in Maricopa County, and that thousands of Republican voters were disenfranchised due to long lines on election day. Equipment was hacked, and printer failures were intentional misconduct intended to deny Kari Lake her crown. Never does her lawsuit acknowledge that voters affected could simply drop their untabulated ballots into a secure box to be counted later, as I highlighted. Meanwhile, the lawsuit claims tens of thousands of early ballots with mismatched signatures were counted, a fact that Lake and her lawyers know, despite not having a single one to offer as evidence of the county's diabolical plot. So that's one of the particularly silly parts of this, and I say silly in the scariest way possible, that Kari Lake and her lawyers will say hundreds of thousands of these had issues with the signatures. Okay, if you have hundreds of thousands of examples, can you show us one? They can't. And so this is very similar to what we saw in 2020, where you have a whole lot of claims, a whole lot of ideas and beliefs behind why the election was stolen, very little evidence that can prove that. And I remember in one of the instances with 2020, Rudy Giuliani was reported to have said, we have a lot of, it was the January 6th Select Committee actually that was interviewing someone who heard Rudy Giuliani say this to them. We have a whole lot of claims without evidence, or something to that effect. And that's exactly true. They were trying to find evidence, which they couldn't, for claims they had already decided they wanted to be true, which is very dangerous. And this continues breaking down the belief and trust in our democratic process, which all the evidence shows our election processes are really good. And so that's a dangerous thing to be doing. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to be a part of what makes this show possible, plus get access to the full video version of the show hours before any of the clips are uploaded to YouTube, plus get a full extra show every single Saturday, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Luke Beasley. That's patreon.com/Luke Beasley, and there's a link in the description.